Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about white blood cells, which are found, of course, in the blood. But what's interesting about that is sometimes white blood cells are capable of actually leaving the bloodstream, meaning they're able to migrate or leap out of the circulatory system in order to chase down foreign invaders. They could be either parasites, they could be bacteria, they could be viruses. And so, yeah, this is going to be a very dynamic and interesting discussion, I think. So let's get right into it. Um, One of the things that I want to say about white blood cells is that sometimes they're called leukocytes, which really translates into white cell. And I can't think too much more of a more important cell than this leukocyte because it's basically responsible for keeping us alive because defense is so important to us. Without these cells maintaining order and protecting us from invading microorganisms, we'd be in big trouble. And so, as you can see in this really awesome scanning electron micrograph, there's a white blood cell right there, and of course it's color enhanced, so it's not really this brilliant white color. But then you can see the red blood cells surrounding it, or erythrocytes. And if you're familiar with these cells, these are the ones that are carrying oxygen mostly, although they carry a little bit of carbon dioxide. But white blood cells are responsible for defense of the body. And so one of the things that's interesting about these white cells, there's many, is that they form a team, and there's basically 5 different kinds of white blood cells. And I find that to be very interesting because the fact that there's 5 different kinds of cells suggests that they specialize. And so they're like little branches, sort of a defense of a nation, that there's different branches that specialize in sort of land defense or water defense or air defense. These white blood cells are specialized to take care of foreign invaders, and they do it uniquely, but together they're quite formidable at fighting off all sorts of invaders and keeping us alive. And so, how do you distinguish? Here's a photo under the light microscope. How do you distinguish between them? This is a picture of all 5 of them. Well, biologists like to classify them and sort of use a criteria, and so this is what we're going with. We're going to choose size to categorize them. All of them have names, and whether or not there's granulars or granulocytes inside the cell. The cells that have them are called granulocytes. Whether or not you have a granule inside of you makes you a granular site. And so also the shape of the nucleus is rather important. Do you notice how some of this nuclei are, this one's kind of large right here and circular, and some of them are sort of like sausage shape. And some of them are sort of like, this one looks like an old telephone right over here. So the shape of the nucleus, and also staining characteristics, whether or not they're staining gives us an indication of what type of cell we're working with. Okay, so here are the 5 names. So just like, don't become intimidated by the names of cells. I can tell you. It's a matter of just getting comfortable knowing them. And it's like being introduced to friends. At first, you might forget their name, but of course, the more you know about them, you'll always remember their names. And so let me go around and introduce you to these 5 new cells to you. So first of all, there's a neutrophil. And so this one right here is a neutrophil, this one that I'm sort of highlighting right here, a neutrophil. And here's a eosinophil right here, which is sort of this reddish color one, and that's how you can categorize that. And then there's the basophil, which is this purpley guy right here, basophil. Okay, so what do these phils have in common with one another? All of these have granules. So these are the granulocytes, the ones that have granules in them. So the neutrophil, eosinophil, and basophil. And then these 2 right here, notice this one's the largest cell of all. It's called agranular, so it does not have granules. And this one does not have granules as well. So these 2 cells or sites, this one's called the monocyte, and this one's called a lymphocyte. Lymphocyte. And so those are the 5 cells. So the granulocytes and the agranulocytes. Okay? So what I'm about to do is sort of go through some general characteristics of leukocytes and then tell you a little bit about what each of those are doing. And so let's do that. So neutrophil. One of the first things that I want to say about a neutrophil, here they are. They're sort of sausage-shaped nuclei. They're a granulocyte. And what's interesting is they make up the vast majority of leukocytes. So this is the most common of all. And they go about fighting off defense by phagocytosis. So in other words, what that means, if you're unfamiliar with it, is that the plasma membrane is fluid, and it can literally stretch out and engulf foreign invaders. And when it's taken in, it's then destroyed by the cell's defensive organelle inside of it, which is called the lysosome. So it literally digests anything foreign. So it goes out and ingests. So eosinophil are stained kind of red, as you can see in this light microscope picture of an eosinophil. These are all red blood cells. The white part's plasma, and then that's a little tiny platelet right there. So here's an eosinophil. Notice that it's a very rare cell. So it's about 2% on average of all of the cells of the body. And so they have a bilobed nucleus, generally like this. And they also, their granules stain usually bright red when you're using a stain called Wright stain, and that's with a W. And then there's basophils, and those stain very easily dark blue. And so you can see the basophil. And again, that's the most rare cell of all. That's 1%. And so you have neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophil. Those are the ones with granules inside. Okay? So what is the eosinophil doing? Well, it does many things, but in general, it's very common in its response to allergies. So if you ever had an allergy, which is a response to something called an allergen, it's not a pathogen, something that causes a disease, but it still invokes a response by the immune system. And so it's these eosinophils that will come to try to destroy and prevent these things from happening. And so the thing about an allergy is that the pathogen's not really dangerous. It's not trying to infect us. And so it's something like pollen. And so what's interesting about that is how the eosinophil works is that it tries to attack parasites. And so parasites, what's this? Well, a parasite could be something like an unwanted worm, like a tapeworm or something. If you were to eat raw fish and it so happened to have a parasitic worm in it and it got into your body, the eosinophil would come after it and try to destroy it. And so what's interesting is I mentioned that the percentages are about 2%, but if a physician were to check your blood and you had a higher eosinophil count of white cells in your blood, that might be an indication to the physician that you have some sort of parasite inside of you. So that's kind of interesting. So these basophils tend to be found around damaged tissue. And what is inside these granulocytes here are a chemical called histamine. And this chemical histamine causes blood vessels, particularly capillaries, to become dilated. And so more fluid will come out of the blood. And so it allows more white blood cells, such as neutrophils and monocytes, to come to an area to destroy the bacteria. So basophils are important there because they're helping. So it's sort of a collaboration. They also produce this chemical heparin, which is an anticoagulant, which also helps the fluidity of the blood in this particular area to aid in defense. So basophil, helping to release histamines, and so that's what's contained in the granulocytes. Back in the eosinophil, these granulocytes right in here contain digestive enzymes which will destroy parasites. So the last two of the white blood cells, the monocyte, which is the largest one, and that's how I like to identify it. It's the largest of all. And then the lymphocyte is interesting because it's kind of the smallest of all. The lymphocyte it's hard to say whether something's easy or not to identify, but it's just a matter of getting used to. But it has very large nucleus, and it almost dominates the whole cell. That's what kind of I go by. It's just a little bit larger than a red blood cell. And so the lymphocyte, let me just jump to the lymphocyte, is the second most common cell. And the thing about that is that it's long-lived. when you get an infection, and I won't go too far into this because this is more of a discussion of how the immune system works, but this obviously is what white blood cells do. But when you get an infection, like for example, if you had a bacterial infection or a virus, these lymphocytes are responsible to, especially the B lymphocyte, they secrete proteins into the plasma called antibodies. And those antibodies help to destroy bacteria and viruses. And what's interesting about that is that the cells that do that are specialized and they remain after the infection's over. And they continue to circulate for years and years in our bloodstream. And so if that virus or bacteria were to come again, we would be immune to it. And so that's what we mean by immunity. So they're long living and they have a large round nucleus and they're quite prevalent. So monocytes are great at phagocytosis. And so they're the largest ones and they can circulate around. And when there's an infection, they become really pumped up and large. And sometimes they're really called like a macrophage. In other words, a big eater, the translation of that. And so here are some lymphocytes. And I was mentioning these proteins that they secrete called antibodies. They're these Y-shaped proteins that can circulate in the plasma, and they can actually, sort of like missiles, they go out and they actually find the foreign invader, and they do it a couple of different ways. I won't go into it in this particular video, but one way that they can destroy foreign cells is they literally bind to them and cause them to agglutinate or clump up, which then makes it easier for the monocyte to engulf them, sort of like throwing a net on criminals, or the neutrophil to come around and engulf it and destroy them through phagocytosis. So all 5 of these white blood cells, the basophil, the neutrophil, the eosinophil, the monocytes, and the lymphocytes, all originate ultimately in the red marrow of long bones, and that's at the tips of the long bones. And they originate from this stem cell that will differentiate, it'll divide and specialize. And this original cell is called the hemocytoblast. This is what it really looks like. So that's the stem cell in the red bone marrow, hemocytoblast. And what's interesting there is that it specializes. It can even specialize into red blood cells. It can specialize into something called platelets or thrombocytes, or the different types of white blood cells. Okay? So that's what's happening. So white blood cells form in the bone marrow. And so when they're released from the bone, here's a nice picture. How about this? If you're looking at slides of cells and they actually had names next to them, that'd be great, right? But you can learn how to identify them. Like here are red blood cells. You can see under the light microscope they're kind of biconcave. Here's plasma. These little fellows are platelets. These are not even considered to be true cells because they're just fragments of cytoplasm from this megakaryocyte, which is a big nucleus cell. They're fragments. See how they're pinching off? So the platelets are not true cells. And one could say that erythrocyte isn't a real cell either because it doesn't contain a nucleus. So during its formation, it jettisons its nucleus. And so the only complete cell in the blood are the white blood cells. So here's a neutrophil. You can see it here. Here's a lymphocyte. What am I going at? This is kind of smaller. It has a very round, large nucleus. Here's the monocyte, which is the largest one of all. So both neutrophil and monocytes phagocytize. Lymphocytes can secrete antibodies. Here's another neutrophil. Here's an eosinophil. Notice the reddish color of the granules. And then here's the basophil, which is staining blue. Okay, and so as I mentioned, white blood cells' main function is that of defense. And so they can do it a couple of different ways. One of them is that they can extend their cytoplasm. This is a cool, again, scanning electron micrograph. So they can sort of move autonomously, sort of like an amoeba, a single-celled protist. They can actually freely move by extending their cytoplasm out, which then causes their membrane to reach out like they're grabbing these bacteria. And this is called phagocytosis or phagocytes. So the neutrophils and the monocytes are best at doing that. But again, what I find clever is that the leukocytes can actually squeeze out of a capillary to do so. So here's a blood vessel. Now, the smallest blood vessel is a capillary. And notice the cell that makes up the capillary is a simple squamous. So two of them make this up. But red blood cells don't leave the circulatory system, but a white blood cell can literally squeeze out into the tissue. Now, what is this? This looks like something like loose connective tissue. This cell's a fibroblast cell, and here's another white cell here, and these strands of protein or collagen mainly. So bacteria are not, altogether easy pickings. And so if there's some bacteria, if there's some bacteria that are sneaking out, look at this. Here's white blood cells. They can actually cling to the sides of blood vessels, and they can literally ease out of the circulatory system, and they come out over here and over here. And what they're trying to do is phagocytize bacteria. And so they're pretty cool. They can move independently. And so what you're seeing is red blood cells moving along, but the white blood cells are these larger ones. And so I find that to be really interesting. So that's an example of the white blood cell leaving the circulatory system and going out and taking care of the bacteria. Now, if I were to draw a bacteria, if I'm capable of doing so, I'd put a bacteria here and here and here. And so then the white blood cell would come along. I'll make the white blood cell blue. And the white blood cell would come along like that and try to engulf it. And so that is pretty interesting. Let me actually take it off of this and come over here if I can and close this just for a second. Let me show you this. This is a cool animation, or not animation, but it's actually time-lapse of a neutrophil. And so you could see the neutrophil here is a white blood cell. These are the red blood cells. And this right over here, this little clump, is bacteria. And so when you start the video in motion, you're going to be able to see that the white blood cell is literally chasing the bacteria. Now, you might be thinking, how does it know where the bacteria is? It doesn't obviously have any eyes. And so it's sensing the presence of bacteria by some chemicals that bacteria release. And so this is known as chemotaxis. In other words, the white blood cell is locating the bacteria based on a chemical, and they're moving toward it. And then once it's engulfed, it takes that phagosome into its cytoplasm, and then it fuses with a lysosome where it's digested. And so that's the way white blood cells mop up. They're kind of like little vacuum cleaners, and they cruise along and they dominate. And so pretty interesting, I think. And so here we have a picture of, again, this is a real slide, and so you can sort of test yourself right here see if you can identify it. And here's a cartoon drawing of the white blood cells. And I want to point out that the white blood cells, though they're important, only make up about 1% of the cells. And so they're certainly far few than the red blood cells. So approximately between 5 and 10,000 white blood cells in a cubic milliliter. And so one of the things that I was mentioning before, and I'll finish with this, is that physicians are very good at determining the problem when a patient comes in by counting the white blood cells. So you could see if the proportions are abnormal, you can sort of indicate whether or not maybe there's a viral infection, maybe there's a little bit more lymphocytes, maybe there's a bacterial infection, maybe there's a parasite, there's a little bit more eosinophil, that sort of thing. And then, what can be very frightening is that sometimes having a really high white blood cell count, you would think, on the surface, well, that's awesome. I have like so many white blood cells. I have the best defensive system. And it's not always the best. Sometimes there's disorders such as autoimmune disorders, and our own white blood cells start to attack our own cells, and that can be problematic. And they can erode things like cartilage and cause arthritis. That's a problem. And then certainly one of the most dangerous problems of all having to do with white blood cells is cancer of the white blood cells, called leukemia. And there's different kinds, but leukemia just in general is a abnormal growth of the intermediate white blood cells during the development process of the mature white blood cell. And so those intermediates which are not non-functional, get released into the bloodstream, and you can see them. It's almost like seeing death. There's so many of them, and in fact, they don't function. So your defensive system's compromised, and so therefore you start getting illnesses and start getting bacterial infections. These are symptoms of leukemia, viral infections, and then eventually the cells start to crowd out in the bone marrow, and you start to get less red blood cell production, and so maybe that's a symptom of leukemia as well, as being anemic and being tired, and then you go into the physician and they discover that you have leukemia. And also the blood doesn't clot properly because of the fact that platelets are also being crowded out, and so that's a real serious problem, leukemia. So thank goodness our white blood cells are working for us, and I hope you enjoyed the video and learned a little bit about it. White blood cells are leukocytes. Thanks for watching.